Emily stopped arguing with me. That's where it all started. You wouldn't think that's a big deal, right? No more arguments should be a good thing. But for us, it wasn't normal. We used to bicker about everything, the color of the walls, which show to watch, even whether the dog needed a bath. Suddenly, she didn't care anymore. And that's when I realized something was off. See, it wasn't just that the argument stopped. It was how she started acting, almost like she wasn't there, like she was going through the motions. We'd sit at the dinner table, and she'd be somewhere else entirely. And I'm not one to overreact or jump to conclusions, but this was different. So, I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I started paying attention, not just to her, but to the things around her. Little things. For example, we used to go to the same cafe every Saturday morning. Same order, same barista. But one weekend, I went alone, and the barista asked, "Emily not coming in today?" He said she'd been in on Tuesdays lately with a friend. She'd never mentioned it to me. That's when I knew something wasn't right. But I didn't explode. I didn't check her phone or start a fight. No, I decided to handle it differently. I approached it like a case, like a mystery. If Emily was hiding something, I'd find out, step by step. I started with the places she went. The cafe, the yoga studio, the storage unit we rented for old junk. At first, it seemed innocent enough. But then I noticed she'd changed the lock on the storage unit. Why? What could she possibly be hiding in there? I didn't want to believe it, but all the signs were pointing in one direction. So I started digging carefully without letting her know. And that's when I found it. A burner phone hidden in a box in the attic. No messages, no calls. Just cryptic notes. Stuff about people being watched and monitored. It didn't make sense. And suddenly, I started to wonder, was this even about an affair? Or was something more dangerous going on? I had to know. But instead of confronting her, I decided to bring in help. Not to tail her around town. No, I needed someone smarter than that. I needed someone who could piece together the bigger picture. That's when I hired Mike, a private investigator. And trust me, that's when things started to get really interesting. Mike was not your typical private investigator. No trench coats or secret stakeouts. He was sharp, practical, and knew how to get answers without drawing attention. When I showed him the burner phone and the cryptic notes, he did not seem fazed. Instead, he looked at me and said, "This is not just an affair. There is more to this." At that point, I was not sure what to believe. Was Emily cheating, or was she involved in something deeper? Either way, I needed to know. Mike got to work quickly. He started digging into her phone records and bank statements, looking for anything unusual. What he found changed everything. Emily had a second account I did not know about. The withdrawals were small, just enough to stay unnoticed, but they were frequent. Every week, small amounts here and there. The strange part? The locations of these withdrawals were nowhere near where she said she had been. I still was not ready to confront her or accuse her outright. Instead, I let Mike keep investigating. He tracked the burner phone calls and found something I never expected. One of the numbers she was calling regularly was familiar. Too familiar. It was Chris, my old business partner, the man I had not spoken to in years. We had parted ways after a business deal went wrong. At first, I could not believe it. Why would Emily be in contact with him? What did he have to do with all this? Mike did not stop there. He found out that Chris had been making moves behind the scenes, using my business connections, my finances, and apparently my wife to set up some kind of elaborate scheme. This was not just about an affair. It was personal. Chris had been using Emily to get back at me for cutting him out all those years ago. That is when it all started to make sense. The cryptic notes on the burner phone about being watched and monitored. They were not about Emily. They were about me. Chris had been keeping tabs on me the entire time, manipulating everything from behind the scenes. Now I had a decision to make. Should I confront Emily and Chris? Or should I wait? Let them think I was still in the dark. Let them make the mistake. I chose the latter. I was not going to blow up our marriage just yet. I was going to turn the tables on both of them. I played along, acting like nothing was wrong. Emily had no idea I was onto her. Every time she left the house, I would watch her go, knowing exactly where she was going and who she was meeting. But this was not just about catching them in the act. It was about taking control. I was not going to be the victim in this game. No, I was going to be the one pulling the strings. With every day that passed, I became more certain of my plan. I was not going to confront Emily or Chris head-on. That would be too easy for them. I wanted them to unravel, to feel like they were in control, right up until the moment they realized I had been running the show all along. The first step was to feed them misinformation. I started small, pretending to be clueless, asking Emily about her busy schedule, as if I believed every excuse she gave me. I would casually mention things like how work was getting more demanding for me, that I might need to go out of town for a few days. Little did she know those fake trips were part of my setup. Mike was in on it too. He helped me create scenarios that would throw them off. We fabricated fake meetings and business dealings that would distract Chris. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on everything. I knew when they were meeting, where they were going, and what they were planning. But here's where things got interesting. I did not just want to catch them. I wanted to use their own game against them. Chris had been pulling strings to sabotage me financially, so I decided to flip the script. Through a few well-placed contacts, I started feeding Chris false information about an upcoming deal I was supposedly working on. Something big, something irresistible. I made it look like there was a way for him to undercut me, to swoop in and take advantage of a situation that did not exist. And, predictably, he took the bait. I watched as he scrambled, pulling strings of his own, trying to leverage the information I had accidentally let slip. It was almost too easy, but that was just the beginning. The next part of the plan was Emily. I needed to make sure she stayed in the dark about what was really going on. So, I played the perfect husband, affectionate, supportive, completely oblivious. I would bring her flowers for no reason, cook her favorite meals, act like nothing had changed. All the while, I was carefully crafting the moment when everything would come crashing down. I also started sending fake texts to Chris from a burner phone, pretending to be Emily. I made it seem like she was growing suspicious of him, that she was having second thoughts about their arrangement. I could see the cracks forming between them. It was only a matter of time before their little affair turned into something much more toxic. Meanwhile, Mike kept gathering evidence. Bank transfers, secret meetings, emails between them. I was building an airtight case, not just to expose the affair, but to ruin them both. By now, Chris thought he was on the verge of a major win, ready to destroy me financially and steal my wife in the process. But he had no idea that every move he made was part of the trap I had set. As for Emily, I was still holding back. I knew she thought she was playing me, that she was getting away with everything. But the truth was, she had no idea what was coming. Soon enough, they would both find out. And when they did, it would be too late. With my plan in motion, all I had to do was watch as Emily and Chris unknowingly dug themselves deeper into the trap. I could see the tension building between them. The fake texts I had been sending to Chris, pretending to be Emily, were doing their job. He began to grow paranoid, wondering if she was really on his side or if she was starting to get cold feet. At home, Emily acted like everything was perfectly normal. She still smiled when I asked her about her day, still gave me that quick kiss on the cheek before heading out for her yoga class or errands. Little did she know I was tracking every single move she made. Mike had installed discreet trackers on her phone and her car, so I knew exactly where she was at all times. Her secret meetings with Chris were not so secret to me anymore. Every time she drove to that cafe across town or stopped by his office late in the evening, I was 2 steps ahead. But I never said a word. I let her keep up the charade, thinking she was in control. Meanwhile, Chris was becoming more reckless. He had fully bought into the fake financial deal I had dangled in front of him. He was making moves, contacting investors, pulling together resources, all to seize this opportunity that did not exist. I had woven such a convincing story. Even the people around him believed it. He was setting himself up for a massive fall, and he was too arrogant to see it coming. The fun part was knowing how far I could push them. I started escalating things. I made sure Emily received anonymous messages, making her think that someone knew about her affair. At first, she dismissed it, but as I kept dropping little hints, like an email from an unknown sender or a phone call that mysteriously hung up, she started to get anxious. Then, I had Mike leave an envelope on the front porch. Inside were photos of her and Chris together, taken from one of their private meetings. She found it when she got home from work, and I could see the panic in her eyes as she opened it. Of course, I pretended not to notice, just asking her how her day was and if she wanted to order takeout. She stammered through a response, barely able to hide her shock. That night, I watched her closely. Emily stayed up late, pacing the bedroom while pretending to scroll through her phone. I could see her mind racing, wondering who had sent the photos and if it meant someone was onto her. She looked at me a few times, probably debating whether to confess or keep lying. I smiled at her, as calm as ever, knowing that she was already caught but had no idea how deep she was in. The cracks between her and Chris were widening. They started arguing during their secret meetups. Mike's recordings picked up snippets of their conversations. Chris accusing Emily of being too sloppy. Emily accusing him of dragging her into something she had not fully agreed to. She was starting to realize that this whole affair was more than she had bargained for. But it was too late for her to back out now. I began planting more seeds of doubt. I left the burner phone in places she would find it, making it look like she had misplaced it. Then I sent a few texts from Chris that were purposely vague, things like "we need to talk" or "something's wrong." Emily would see them, and her paranoia would kick into overdrive. I watched her delete the texts, but I knew they had rattled her. Then came the financial part of the plan. Chris was knee-deep in the fake deal, having poured a significant amount of money into it. I made sure he thought he was on the verge of a massive payday, all while knowing he was walking into a financial disaster. Through a series of staged meetings and fake emails, I made it seem like I was completely unaware of his involvement, like I was just another pawn in his game. But in reality, every dollar he invested was going to vanish into thin air. One evening, while Emily was out, I went into her office at home. I had already seen enough emails between her and Chris to know how they were communicating, and I logged into her account. I sent an email to Chris from her address, pretending to be her, telling him she was having doubts and wanted out. I knew it would send him into a panic. Sure enough, the next day, Mike caught them meeting again, and this time, things escalated. Chris was furious, accusing Emily of trying to back out and leave him hanging. Emily was confused, denying that she had ever sent the email. Their argument was heated, and it was the first time I saw real cracks in their alliance. I let it play out, watching as they started to unravel. Emily was no longer the confident, calculating woman she had tried to be. She was scared now, unsure of what was happening and who to trust. Chris, on the other hand, was growing desperate, throwing more money and effort into the fake deal, hoping it would save him. But the deeper he went, the more he doomed himself. And me? I stayed calm, still playing the role of the loving, oblivious husband. But inside, I knew the moment of reckoning was coming soon. They thought they had control, but little by little, I was tightening the noose around both of them. All it would take was one final push, and their whole world would collapse. That push was coming, and they would never see it coming. The weeks passed, and everything was moving exactly as I planned. The tension between Emily and Chris was reaching a boiling point. Every time they met, it was less about their affair and more about pointing fingers. Chris accusing her of being careless, and Emily blaming him for dragging her into this mess. What had started as a secretive, thrilling affair had become a burden neither of them could manage. And I was sitting back, watching it all unfold. But now it was time to tighten the noose. I had let them believe they had the upper hand for long enough. They thought they were playing me, keeping their dirty little secret hidden away, but every move they made was under my control. Every decision, every panic-driven choice was exactly what I had predicted. I started by escalating the financial scheme. Chris had thrown a lot of money into this business deal I had fabricated, and he was expecting a major payoff soon. So, I made sure he believed the deal was just about to close. Mike and I set up fake conference calls, sent him phony legal documents, and staged a meeting with a business partner Chris thought would seal the deal. Of course, that partner was working for me, playing the role of a shady investor. During the meeting, we made sure Chris got a taste of just how bad things could get. The investor hinted that things were not as solid as Chris believed, that there were legal issues cropping up and certain government regulations that could make the deal fall apart. The panic on Chris's face was priceless. He tried to play it cool, telling the investor he could handle it, but I could see him sweating. He was deep in it now, and there was no easy way out. But I was not done. I wanted to push him further, make him desperate enough to make mistakes. So, I arranged for another hit, an unexpected expense in the form of a legal fee that Chris had not anticipated. When he saw the bill, he was livid. I heard through Mike that he spent the entire evening trying to figure out how to cover it, draining more of his personal savings into the fake deal. And all the while, he thought he was playing me. The irony was almost too much. At home, Emily was starting to unravel. She had found another one of those mysterious envelopes. This time, it was left on her car. Inside were more photos of her with Chris, but I had edited these to make it look like someone had been following them for weeks, watching their every move. The look on her face when she found it was one of pure fear. She knew someone was onto her, but she did not know who. Every night, she was more on edge. She would sit up late, scrolling through her phone, glancing over at me as if she was waiting for me to bring it up. But I never did. I let her stew in her own paranoia. The tension between us grew, but I kept playing my part, supportive, loving, clueless. And it drove her crazy. One evening, after another one of her late meetings, she came home visibly shaken. She tried to act normal, but I could see it in her eyes. She was falling apart. I asked her, casually, if everything was okay. She just nodded, avoiding my gaze, and went straight to bed. She knew she was caught in something much bigger than she could handle, but she was still hoping she could get out of it without me finding out. Poor Emily, she had no idea. Meanwhile, Mike had uncovered even more. He tracked down a few of Chris's personal contacts, people he had been borrowing money from. Chris was not just losing his own money. He was using investors, friends, even family to fund his fake deal. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came after him. I made sure to plant a few more seeds of doubt among his network, sending anonymous messages to his contacts, hinting that their money might not be as safe as they thought. Chris was cornered. Emily was crumbling. And I was ready to make my final move. But before I could deliver the final blow, I needed to set the stage perfectly. I arranged one last meeting between Chris and the fake investor. This time it would all come crashing down. I made sure to let Chris think he was getting exactly what he wanted, a confirmation that the deal was closing, that all his work was about to pay off. I could almost picture the relief on his face as he sat down in that meeting room, thinking the nightmare was over, that he was finally going to win. But what he did not know was that Mike had already prepared everything to expose him. We had gathered enough evidence to not only ruin Chris, but also implicate Emily in the whole mess. I had all the documents, recordings, and proof I needed to blow their world apart. The night before the meeting, I decided to push Emily just a little bit further. I left the burner phone out where she would see it, this time with a single message on the screen. It read, "I know everything." When she found it, I watched the color drain from her face. She could not hide her panic. I asked her what was wrong, playing the concerned husband, but she just shook her head, saying she was not feeling well. She went to bed early, but I knew she would not be sleeping. I could hear her tossing and turning, probably wondering how much longer she could keep this up. The next day was the meeting, and that is when everything would come crashing down. Chris would realize he had been conned, Emily would realize her perfect little secret was shattered, and I would be the one standing there, watching them both lose everything. They had no idea the storm that was about to hit them. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk into it. The day of the meeting had arrived, and I knew it was only a matter of hours before the entire thing blew up in their faces. I woke up early, feeling that eerie sense of calm before the storm. Emily, on the other hand, was a wreck. She could barely make eye contact with me during breakfast, nervously stirring her coffee while pretending to read something on her phone. I knew she was close to breaking, but I did not push her. Not yet. I kissed her on the cheek as I left for work, and she tried to muster a smile. "See you tonight," I said, acting like nothing was wrong. She nodded but said nothing. She probably thought she could still control everything, that she could keep both lives separate a little longer. But by tonight, her world would be unrecognizable. I spent the morning coordinating with Mike, making sure every detail was in place for the final move. The fake investor was ready to meet Chris at noon, and that meeting was going to be a disaster. Mike had already positioned himself to record everything, and I had no doubt that Chris would crack under the pressure once he realized what was happening. By early afternoon, it began. Chris entered the meeting thinking he was finally about to get the payout he had been desperately chasing. I imagined the relief he must have felt, thinking that he was about to fix all the problems he had created. He probably believed this was his moment of victory, that he had outplayed me, and everything would work out. But what happened in that room was the exact opposite. As soon as Chris sat down, the investor hit him with the news. Everything was falling apart. The deal he had invested so much in was crumbling, legal issues were blocking the way, and there was no way out. Mike told me later that Chris tried to bluff, tried to act like he could still salvage it, but it was clear from the start that he was in way over his head. The investor pressed him, asking for more money to smooth things over and to deal with the so-called legal fees. Chris, desperate and sweating, finally snapped. He admitted that he did not have the money. He started ranting about how he had been deceived, how this whole thing was a setup. Mike captured everything on tape, every frantic word. It did not take long for Chris to realize he had been played. He stormed out of the meeting, humiliated and panicked. And that was when I made my next move. I had Mike send the audio recording of the meeting to a few key people, Chris's investors, his business contacts, and most importantly, Emily. I could only imagine what it must have been like for her to listen to that recording. The man she had been cheating with, the one who had convinced her to betray me, was exposed as the fraud he truly was. I had not just caught her in an affair, I had caught her in the middle of a collapsing scam. I knew she was probably starting to connect the dots, realizing that everything was falling apart because of me. But I was not done yet. After Chris left the meeting, I sent him one final message, pretending to be Emily. It simply said, "We are finished." That message hit him hard, just as I expected. He would think Emily was abandoning him in his moment of need, leaving him to clean up the mess alone. That afternoon, I went back home early, just as everything was starting to unravel. I walked through the door like it was any other day, but the house was quiet. Too quiet. Emily was sitting in the living room, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She had heard everything by then. The failed meeting, the recording, the disaster Chris had walked into. She must have been piecing it together all day, realizing that the whole situation was spiraling out of control. She looked up at me as I stepped into the room, her mouth opening as if she wanted to say something, but the words did not come. I could see the fear in her eyes, fear of what I knew, of what I had done, of what would happen next. But I did not say anything. Not yet. Instead, I sat down across from her, calmly, and let the silence hang between us for a few moments. I watched her squirm, waiting for her to speak, to confess, to admit what I already knew. But she stayed silent, too afraid to even start. "You look stressed," I said finally, my voice casual, as if I was talking about the weather. "Something on your mind?" Emily's lip trembled, and she looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her shirt between her fingers. "Jason," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I held up my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let me save you the trouble," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I know everything, Emily. I have known for a long time. You and Chris? The burner phone? The money you have been hiding? The meetings, the scam, the lies? All of it." Her face went white, and for a moment, I thought she might pass out. "Jason, please, let me explain," she stammered, but I shook my head. "There is nothing you can say that I do not already know," I said, my voice low and controlled. "You betrayed me. You lied to me. And you did it with a man who was trying to ruin my life." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "But what you do not realize, Emily, is that I have been ahead of you this whole time. Every step of the way." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But I did not feel sorry for her. Not anymore. I am not going to make a scene. I'm not going to shout or throw things. I continued. "Because, Emily, I have already won. You and Chris thought you could play me, but you were the ones being played." I stood up, looking down at her as she sobbed into her hands, completely broken. I had waited for this moment, for the truth to finally come out, and now that it had, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "I have already filed for divorce," I said, my voice steady. "I have the evidence I need. Everything you have done, every lie you have told, it is all documented. The money you have taken, the affair, the conspiracy with Chris, it is all over." Emily looked up at me, her eyes wide and full of panic. "Please, Jason," she begged through her tears. "Do not do this. I am so sorry. I will do anything to fix this. Please, do not leave me. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. I had no intention of staying. There was nothing left to save. I had planned this for too long, set everything in motion, and now I was ready to walk away. You are on your own now, I said, turning toward the door. You and Chris can figure out how to clean up this mess. But I am done. And with that, I left her sitting there, broken and defeated. The final act was complete, and I was walking out of their lives, unscathed, while they were left to deal with the destruction I had orchestrated. By the time I reached the door, I felt lighter than I had in months. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the games, they were behind me. And as I walked out of that house for the last time, I knew one thing for sure. I had won. Leaving the house that day should have felt final, like slamming a door on everything that had gone wrong. But as I walked away, I knew there was still one last thing to do. I had set everything in motion for Chris to collapse financially, and I had broken Emily emotionally. But that was only half of the plan. I wanted them to feel the consequences in every part of their lives, not just in their bank accounts or in their personal guilt, but publicly. Their reputations, their careers, their very lives needed to crumble as thoroughly as they had tried to destroy mine. It was not enough to walk away and let them sort through the wreckage I had left. No, I needed to make sure they were left with nothing, no safety net, no easy way out, and definitely no place to hide from the fallout. That night, after leaving Emily sobbing in the living room, I drove to the office. I had a few final calls to make, and I needed to set up the final stage of the plan. When I arrived, the office was quiet, empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as I settled into my chair and fired up my computer. I opened my email and started drafting the final message that would seal their fate. This email was not going to a lawyer or a financial advisor. It was going to the people who would care the most about what Chris and Emily had done. Their colleagues, their clients, their so-called friends. The subject line was simple, an important revelation. Inside, I laid out everything: Chris's shady deals, Emily's part in them, the financial scam they had been running behind the scenes. I attached the evidence Mike and I had gathered, the bank records, the email chains, the recorded conversations between them. Everything was neatly organized, like a well-wrapped gift, ready to implode their lives. It was all there, undeniable, and once sent, it would spread like wildfire through their personal and professional networks. I knew what this would do to Chris. He had built his reputation on being a savvy businessman, someone who played by the rules, someone people trusted. This email would shatter that image. No one would trust him again. Investors would back out. Deals would collapse. And he would be left scrambling to salvage whatever crumbs he could. Emily, too, would not escape unscathed. Her job at the marketing firm? Gone. Her friendships, built on shared gossip and shared secrets? Those would vanish as soon as people realized she had been living a double life. I could already imagine the whispers behind her back, the sympathetic smiles that hid judgment. She would be left to face the consequences of her choices, alone. But I was not ready to hit send just yet. No, first I wanted to make sure they felt the pressure building. I wanted them to squirm a little more. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the quiet city beyond. In a few days, everything would change for them. For now, though, they still had hope. Chris probably thought he could salvage the deal somehow, and Emily likely believed she could fix things between us. But soon enough, they would see how wrong they were. The next step was setting up a meeting with Chris. I wanted to see him face to face one last time. Not for a confrontation, but to watch him as he realized just how badly he had been played. I drafted a quick email to him, suggesting we meet to discuss things. I knew he would not be able to resist. He would assume I was coming to him for some desperate reconciliation, maybe to smooth over the financial disaster he had fallen into. Little did he know, this was the beginning of the end for him. I scheduled the meeting for the next day at a quiet cafe downtown, a neutral space where Chris would feel comfortable, thinking he still had control of the situation. Once that was in place, I made another call to Mike. I told him I wanted this meeting recorded, just like the others. Mike had a knack for staying invisible, for capturing every word without anyone ever knowing he was there. And I wanted this conversation on record, too, for my final insurance. The next morning, I woke up feeling sharper, more focused. This was it, the final stage. I had spent months planning this, months watching Chris and Emily trip over their own lies, and now I was about to close the chapter for good. When I arrived at the cafe, Chris was already there, sitting at a small table near the back, a forced smile on his face. He looked nervous, tapping his fingers against the table, probably wondering what this meeting was really about. I walked over, keeping my expression neutral, and sat down across from him. "Jason," he said, his voice trying to sound casual but coming out strained. "I was not sure what to expect when you emailed me." I leaned back, studying him for a moment. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes, his suit slightly wrinkled. The stress was starting to show. "I figured we should talk," I said, keeping my tone measured. "It seems like there's a lot we need to clear up." Chris nodded quickly, relief flashing in his eyes. He probably thought this was his chance to explain, to weasel his way out of the mess he had created. "I know things have gotten complicated," he started, "but I think we can work through this. The deal, it is not as bad as it looks. There are ways we can fix it." I almost laughed. He still believed there was a way out. He still thought he could control the situation. "Is that so?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Chris continued, his voice growing more confident. "I have a few contacts I can reach out to. We can restructure the deal, get the investors back on board. It will take some time, but I can fix this. We just need to keep working together." I let his words hang in the air for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "You do not get it, do you, Chris?" I said, my voice calm but firm. "There is no deal. There never was." His smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" I said slowly, that this whole thing has been a setup. From the very beginning. The deal, the investors, everything. It was all fake. Just like you." Chris stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what I was saying. "No, that is not possible," he muttered, shaking his head. "That cannot be right." "It is," I said, leaning back again. "You thought you were pulling the strings, but you were the one being played." He was silent for a moment, his face going pale as the truth sank in. "You did this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded. Every step of the way. Chris slumped back in his chair, his confidence evaporating. I could see the panic setting in, the realization that he had lost everything. You destroyed me," he said, his voice trembling. "No, Chris," I replied. "You destroyed yourself. I just gave you the rope." For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us. I could see Chris's mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next, but there was no way out for him. He was finished. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. "It is over, Chris. There is nothing left to discuss. I just wanted you to know how this ends." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with desperation. "Jason, wait." But I did not wait. I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Chris sitting there in the wreckage of his own making. Mike would be sure to send me the recording later, not that I needed it. This moment was seared into my memory, the final piece of my plan falling into place. As I stepped out into the street, I felt the cool air hit my face, the weight of everything lifting from my shoulders. The game was over. Chris was done. And Emily? She was about to face the same fate. I pulled out my phone and opened the email I had drafted the night before, the one that would send their world crashing down for good. I hovered over the send button for a moment, then pressed it. It was done. Now it was time to watch the final fallout unfold. The email went out, and the impact was immediate. Within hours, the ripple effect began. I could almost feel the shockwaves as Chris's and Emily's lives began to unravel in real time. First came the frantic phone calls from mutual friends, colleagues, and investors. I did not answer any of them. I did not need to. Everything was already in motion. By the next morning, Chris's entire financial network had crumbled. The investors pulled out. His reputation, carefully built over the years, was in ruins. The people who once trusted him were now circulating the emails I had sent, calling out his dishonesty. As I had predicted, there was no way back for him. The panic was setting in, and I knew that he was scrambling to make sense of how everything had collapsed so quickly. Emily, on the other hand, was facing a different kind of fallout. By midday, her colleagues at the marketing firm had received the email, and the truth about her affair and role in Chris's schemes became public knowledge. She did not go into work that day. Instead, she called me several times, in fact, but I did not answer. I had no more words for her. Whatever she had to say, it no longer mattered. I had heard her lies enough, and now it was time for her to deal with the consequences on her own. That evening, I returned to the house one last time. I had already packed up my things the night before, quietly, without her knowing. When I arrived, Emily was waiting for me. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from hours of crying, and she looked as if she had not slept in days. The confident, carefree woman who once thought she could deceive me was gone. In her place was someone desperate and broken. "Jason, please," she began, her voice trembling. I made a mistake. I am sorry. I was stupid. I was selfish, but please do not leave me. We can fix this." I stood in the doorway, watching her crumble in front of me, but I felt nothing. The months of betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, they had drained me of any sympathy I might have once had. Her apologies were meaningless now. Too little too late. "There is nothing to fix, Emily," I said calmly. "You and Chris made your choices, and now you are both paying for them." She fell to her knees, sobbing, pleading with me. I did not mean for this to happen. I was scared. I thought I was trapped, that Chris could help, but I never wanted it to go this far. "Please, Jason, we can get through this." I shook my head. "You should have thought about that before you threw everything away." Her sobs grew louder, but I remained cold, unmoved. I had planned this outcome for too long to let her emotions sway me now. The destruction was complete, and there was nothing left to salvage. "I have already filed for divorce," I said, pulling out the final set of papers from my bag. "I suggest you get a lawyer. You're going to need one." Emily's tears stopped abruptly, her face a mask of disbelief as I placed the papers on the table. She stared at them, realization setting in that this was truly the end. I love you, Jason," she whispered, her voice hollow. But love had nothing to do with it anymore. Whatever we had was long gone, consumed by betrayal and deceit. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, leaving her behind for good. Weeks passed, and as Chris and Emily continued to deal with the fallout, I felt a strange sense of calm. Their lives were in shambles. Chris lost everything he had worked for, and Emily had become a social pariah, her once perfect life shattered. Every day, they faced the consequences of their actions, but I had moved on. In the end, I had won, but it did not feel like victory. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction in watching their lives crumble. It was more of a quiet release, knowing that I was free from the lies and manipulation. I had taken control, pulled the strings, and exposed them for who they really were. But beyond that, I felt nothing. As the divorce finalized and the last loose ends were tied up, I realized that revenge had not given me the closure I had hoped for. It had only made me more aware of how much I had lost, my marriage, the life I thought I had, and the person I used to be. There was no going back, but there was freedom in knowing that I had left the wreckage behind. And so I walked away, free from them, free from the past and ready to begin again.